at this fantastic conference. And if so, I am sure that the panelists that we have here today are going to definitely wake you up and get your minds thinking in different directions. So, while the last few people are trickling in, I'll introduce myself. I'm Mhairi Stewart. I am currently head of the Berlin School of Public Engagement and Open Science. And I was previously head of public engagement at the University of St Andrews. And I'm on the public engagement advisory boards for several societies, such as the Royal Society of Edinburgh and the Young Academy of Scotland. I'll introduce our speakers in a moment. I'll introduce them all together, then I'll give you an introduction to our session. Then I'll invite our speakers to give their thoughts on the topic of international public engagement and science communication and what's the future for it. So first of all, this is a hybrid session, so I'll introduce our in-person speaker. This is Wiebke Roschig. Wiebke is the Director of Science and Society at the Falling Walls Foundation, and she'll be telling us about their international activity, their groundbreaking and fantastic international activity. Online, going to be piped into us as we go ahead, we have Marina Joubert. Now, Marina is a senior researcher in science communication. Hello, Marina. At CREST, the Center for Research on Evaluation, Science and Technology at Stellenbosch University in South Africa. And that's where she's coming in from today. And she was the center for creating the first program in science communication and engagement in Africa. And she is also on several international editorial and advisory boards on science communication and public engagement. We also have, from the UK, we have Savita Wilmot. Savita is the chief executive of the Natural History Consortium in Bristol, in the UK. And she is also heading up an international activity in public engagement called Intersections. Intersections has been going for a couple of years now, and it hosts activities such as a Europe-wide BioBlitz activity, which is a large citizen science activity, but also she hosts the Global Science Show with Global Science Show coordinators, and that's a show on Twitter that researchers can take part in. So, I'll introduce our session now, and it's a session on international science communication and public engagement. And what does the future hold for that? What is the prospects of it, and what is the future? I want to say a few words about what we're discussing. So we're talking about a spectrum here. We're talking about a spectrum from information dissemination all the way through to stakeholder dialogue, which can help to shape research and to shape the impact that research could be making. Either way, dissemination or dialogue, the goal is to result in a mutual benefit, including benefit to the research, to the researchers, and to the academy as a whole. Now, to be open to getting benefits, then of course the academic actors must also be open to influence. They must be open to valuing non-academic knowledge, and yes, perhaps relinquishing control a little bit. And we'll talk about that in our talks as well. I think it's important to say that in science communication and public engagement in this panel is viewed as a spectrum of activity with a spectrum of format, a spectrum of form, and a spectrum of purpose for undertaking that activity. And that neither end of that spectrum is less valuable than the other. We value both dissemination of information and dialogue. And I believe that Marina is going to talk a little more about that as well. But in an international format, how does science communication and public engagement function? What does it look like? And what are the challenges and the opportunities for the future in undertaking international activity? With that, I'm going to go over to our first speaker. Our first speaker is Mhairi Joubert from South Africa. So while we get her slides up on the screen and Mhairi starts her talk, yes, I'll let Mhairi introduce herself. So here we go. Thank you very much. Mhairi.
Thank you very, very much. I'm just going to ask that maybe we zoom out a little bit so that I can see the screen, or, otherwise I can't see my own slides if it's going to be controlled from there. Okay. That's maybe a bit too much, but I think that should work. Let me try it this way. So today, my job for today is to set the scene in a way to think a little bit about where are we on this trajectory of science communication and public engagement with science. And my own career, played out in South Africa, but I learned so much and gained so much and benefited so much from what was happening internationally and also from international collaboration. And now we are at this point where we're thinking today about specifically engagement and whether international collaboration can work well. So to go to the next slide, if I think back on my own career over 3 decades, I started out in science communication practice very much in what I would call a kind of SOS mode, send out stuff. And also, you can maybe carry on to the next animation there, this idea of, in terms of dissemination, we'll throw it over the wall. Let's hope for the best. Let's hope it reaches the audiences that we intended to reach. That was kind of how science communication practice happened when I started. And when we started thinking a little bit more about the audiences that we engage with and how we cared about them, you can go to the next slide. We it became a kind of a numbers game, counting what we love to call bums on seats. How many people showed up? How many people did we actually engage with? Without thinking too much about whether, our efforts were really meeting the needs of the audiences and how they responded to what we provided to them. The buzzwords at the time, in the next slide, I've kind of thought about what were the things that were really talked about at the time. And they were mostly things like public understanding of science, scientific literacy, disseminating research, public appreciation of science, public awareness of science. But we didn't often enough question the real motives behind these things. Was it really about awareness? I mean, what do you want to do with awareness? Was it really about appreciation? Was it more about public support? You can carry on, please, to the next slide. And next, please. So I think as social science research started giving us more opportunity to reflect on this relationship between science and society and to think about what was really our goals in terms of scientific literacy or improving public understanding of science or even just awareness of science. And in the next slide, I try to think about this idea that we became more and more aware of the importance of building bridges and interactions between science and society. But also, I think it's very important to recognize that science communication does have some intrinsic value. There is value in disseminating information about science. Maybe not everybody is interested, but there are people who want to engage with science. And it's incredibly important to make sure that new advances about science are available in an accessible and clear format. So there's nothing wrong inherently with dissemination, but we had to start thinking about, do we stop at dissemination only, or where do we go after that? And in the next slide, I talk about this field that has now developed into sort of social science research insights into science communication, where you can go through a few. Vipka, please just advance as I talk. The first bullet says, we assume that a lack of information about understanding explains why people do not accept scientific claims or evidence. But now we know that this is simply wrong. We know that it's true that people need information, but just giving people information will not necessarily lead to more support. In fact, we now have solid evidence that knowledge itself actually will play a minimal role, if any, in science-related attitudes. And so we started to increasingly to realize that if we wanted a supportive and trusting public, we definitely needed to go beyond just dissemination of information. I hope we are keeping track. So the next slide is about the deficit model. If you can maybe make sure that you advance to that. So the deficit model has been much discussed and much discredited and much debated. It's really just basically about the one-way top-down dissemination of scientific information based on the assumption that any skepticism towards scientific findings will vanish if we simply give people more information. Now, we know that is not the case. Even a careful explanation of evolution will not necessarily convince people who are, creationists. And decades of facts and data about climate change have failed to persuade climate change denialists. So we know that information alone, there's nothing wrong with providing people information, but we know that that's not necessarily going to persuade people. And the important thing for me to recognize about the deficit model is that the problem is not the provision of information. The problem is the assumption that people will accept and support information that we provide to them. I think it's quite well summarized in this slide. It's a tweet by Professor Eric Jensen. If you can maybe carry on, just go further down to that tweet. One more. Next slide. In this tweet, he says, sort of didactic or learning-oriented communication is perfectly legitimate and useful, but it's not the same as the deficit model, which is the logical fallacy that increasing scientific knowledge will necessarily make people align their attitudes more with the institutional scientific position. I think that's just important to keep in mind that if we say we should move away from the deficit model, it's moving away from this assumption. It's not necessarily moving away from giving people information about science. So in the next slide, I talk a little bit about all the reasons why we became aware of why we need to move away from this deficit model. And the first thing was that we increasingly knew, and also evidence from social science research, that simply giving people information is not enough to build trust and support. It's a good and moral thing to give people information, but if you focus on that only, if you stop there, if you just provide facts and information, you're very likely to fail. In the next slide, the reason for this, of course, and there's a massive body of social psychology and behavioral research now that tells us that people filter the information we give them, through their own belief systems and own views, and therefore more knowledge will not necessarily equate more support. People respond differently when given exactly the same information. And in the next slide, I talk about another important reason for moving away from a pure deficit approach to dialogue, and that is simply the idea that the public wants to have a say. Public is no longer happy to be left out of these conversations. And importantly, and that's why I underlined it, public input can benefit science. So these are some of the reasons for this shift from deficit to dialogue or to engagement. There are, of course, many more. And increasingly, the scientific community started realizing, we need bridges, we need interactive connections, we need conversations, we need these social conversations between science and society, which I try to explain with this visual in this slide. And next slide is then, let's see, there. So public engagement became the next big thing all around the world. And we observed all these trends are very much here from South Africa as it happened in the UK, in Europe, in the US. The sort of new buzz about public engagement, how important it was. And this definition of the AAAS is used quite widely, talking about intentional, meaningful interactions that provide opportunities for mutual learning between scientists and members of the public. And it's something that's getting a lot of support and a lot of attention, but it's also not necessarily something that is easy to achieve. In an analysis in the next slide, if you can go to this one, it's got see a graph there. There was an analysis done by me and some colleagues at Stellenbosch University just to show how much attention this topic of public engagement of science has been getting. And we looked for, in the Web of Science, for articles that combined science and public engagement. And you can just see the growth over time. So there's also in this article, there's lots of other graphs just showing the trend about how much people have been paying attention to this new phenomenon. But in the next slide, as you can see, we also noticed, and this has again been hotly debated, that deficit-style science communication persists, and it does persist for some very good reasons. So we've realized in the next slide, then engagement is crucial, but there's a place for the deficit model. Sometimes people really need to hear from experts, and also public information can actually be a prerequisite for democratic debate about science and science-related experts. So we don't want to get away from information dissemination completely, but we do want to get away from the assumption that information dissemination alone is enough. So next, I said, engagement is the new buzzword, but we've also come to realize that it has limitations in terms of scale and time and resources and skills, that scientists are not necessarily prepared for this new way. Mhairi talked about the challenges of, for scientists of giving up some of their control and authority and autonomy over science, and the challenges of helping scientists to appreciate different ways of knowing knowledge in science. There's also some challenges around expectations of the audiences that you engage with. It is, of course, very context and topic specific, and that's also a challenge for, taking it international. There's lack of recognition in many academic environments. And then sometimes we also ask the question, is it really meaningful? Or is it another phase of kind of window dressing or science washing, where we just pretend to engage people, but in the end, science will still go the way it wants to go. So in the next slide, I will then very briefly just say something about how these models have then evolved and emerged and continue to evolve and continue to morph, actually. So if you go to the next slide, you'll see I've got something there about a way of looking at these models, showing how the deficit model sort of extends, can lead to dialogue and can lead to participation. And then next, thinking about, you can maybe just carry on because there's a few animations in this slide, how public understanding of science and engagement with science and public participation. I'm just beginning to be increasingly aware of how these models are not freestanding, but they actually feed into and on one another. And then there's a slide, if you can go to a slide that says the Rosette model of science engagement. This one, I think, really explains it rather well, where you can see clearly how the different approaches to community and public engagement can overlap and support one another with increasing interaction as you evolve around these. This model was developed by Australian science communication practitioner and researcher Dr. Jenny Metcalf as part of her PhD studies. But once again, what's interesting for me is that it's a closed loop. Where once you've had your engagement, it may lead back to information dissemination. Next, in practice, we know and we see increasingly that these models coexist, they overlap. There are no sharp lines or divisions between them, but rather a continuum of models. And this is obviously what happens in practice. And I also like the way in the next slide, how this book chapter by Broussard and Loewenstein explains the deficit model or the information provision model as a background, sort of in the background, and how all these other models actually, are superimposed on top of that and depend on providing information first. So in the next slide, I'm also almost done. I really like to think of science communication and public engagement with science as two sides of the same coin. They really cannot exist one without the other. But you can maybe then go to the last slide, where I basically we just reminded that science engagement can be sometimes messy, as it was discussed in this Nature editorial, can head in unexpected directions, and it's a new paradigm. It's often easier said than done, and it's very important, I think, to discuss in terms of international collaboration, as we are going to do today, what are its potentials and what are its limitations. Thank you very much.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Marina. We will come back at the end for questions. So if you have any questions for Marina, please hold on, and we'll come on after all the other speakers. I see there are hands up. We'll come back to you. Okay. So our next speaker, I'm delighted to introduce, is Wiebke Roschek. And interestingly, that Marina finished there with unexpected directions, because I often think of unexpected directions as also being opportunities. And I think that Wiebke is going to talk about some of the projects your team do and the opportunities that come out of that. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. Is it working? Yeah. It's really great to be here, so thank you. But I just took over yesterday from my colleague Anja, so please bear with me that I will stick to my notes a little bit more than normally. Yeah, at Falling Walls, we have a long focus on science communication. So like excellent science be communicated in an excellent way. We were founded in 2009 with the idea to bring science to stage, just like we put a rock star to stage. We have voices of God come telling this is the breakthrough of physics of this year. So it's kind of staging science and having a science communication in a very different and new way. So take a look at our content library if you want to. And yeah, so as an add-on, so that kind of fits to what Marina just said, we still believe in this different ways of communicating science to different publics and disseminating the knowledge as well. But since 2018, we decided to add another layer, which is science engagement. And we are therefore also looking in our Falling Walls language for the breakthrough in science engagement each year. So we have also settled, so that's maybe a good entrance that my colleague prepared me here so neatly. We decided to define science engagement for us as an activity, event, or interactions to bridge the gap that might be there between science and other parts of society, to generate mutual learning and mutual benefits across the spectrum of public engagement in science and science communication. So for us, per definition, science engagement is always the two-way process, just like we had heard that from Marina now, co-creation and active involvement. And so under this definition, we have started to host a yearly pitch event. So we have a global call for nominations where people can apply or be nominated with projects in science engagement. And the jury selects the best 20 projects. They are invited to come to Berlin, pitch their project there on stage, and the jury selects the breakthrough of the year in science engagement. And this breakthrough project will be presented on the 9th of November in our lineup of breakthroughs in research. And the idea behind that is, of course, we want to not only stage that and show best practices, but also generate visibility for science engagement in front of these about 600 high-ranking guests and carry that more into research, into policy making, and into decision making in general. So that's how we started. And from that, can you see that? It's actually supposed to be a world map. It's really gray on gray. Sorry. From that, we built up a network. So we realized people really come to our pitch events. They really want to exchange. We have now a network of around 3,500 science engagement practitioners all around the world, 152 countries, I just checked now. And we see how this community is extremely eager to exchange. So on this international basis, so really get to know what is best practices in other countries, what are actually projects that work out well with different stakeholder groups or target groups, and how can we actually connect? How can we do projects together? So all this really vibrant process is took place every year in Berlin when we chose all these projects to come. So we decided there's such a need for that that we created regional hubs, and you can see our 9 hubs that we have so far, and we hope to open some more. Some regions are still a little blank here, but our idea is each of these hubs has a hub manager and with expertise and network on a regional level. And all hub events then consist of 3 main activities. So we do community engagement, co-learning processes, bringing together the international science engagement practitioners with the regional interested people that we gather in our hubs. We have an activation aspect always in involving scientists who are not yet engaging with their research and trying to show best practices, trying to get them into engagement. And then we aim for a perception change in these regional contexts, as well to public as towards academia, for an institutionalization of science engagement. So this huge network of our more than 3,000 science engagement practitioners, we see that this is a huge value. So we are very committed people with very different expertises, sharing their knowledge very freely and really, being engaged themselves in the science engagement matter. So we asked our network, what do they think is a key challenge where science engagement really would make a difference in the world? And the really majority of our engagers voted for climate and health issues. So we decided in this year, as a kind of trial run, to focus all our hub events on planetary health as a topic, and partnered with the Planetary Health Alliance in that, and with different scientists working on planetary health, and really gather expertise on how could we engage publics on all topics around planetary health. And plus, we initiated a debating process we call the cascading debates, where in these hubs and with our local science engagement partners, we host local community-based debates, which we document and feed into a high-ranking discussion panel on the 8th of November at our Falling World Science Summit. So the idea to really integrate debates into policymaker and decision-maker panels. So maybe just to share a little bit what we are now envisioning for this network, and which we would really also encourage you to join and take a look at. Our vision is we want to really develop this community platform into a platform for action, with the idea that a global challenge like climate change or climate crisis, planetary health crisis in general, can only be tackled globally with the idea of science engagement, but also with a global scheme of really working together. And we really would like to collect and spread the expertise that is already there, and it's so rich in all countries, and really call for a dialogue between these science engagers with so many different fields of expertise and target groups they are working with, and embed the local debates that take place all over the world into a more global decision maker one. And then, of course, create kind of a model that can be replicated, and a global engagement scheme around the planetary health issues. So we believe that this, in a grassroots level or an upwards moving process, could really develop a valuable engagement scheme that might make a difference globally. So, and with that, I'll close.
Thank you so much, Wiebke. That's fantastic. And yes, thank you for coming in at the last minute. I should have said that up front. And finally, but definitely not least, we're going to go on to Savita Wilnot in the UK. And she's going to be talking, we've had the picture frame for us. We're talking about opportunities and expansion. Savita's going to talk more about delivery of engagement, I believe. So over to you, Savita. Thank you. We don't seem to be able to actually hear you, Savita. Could we just double check on the mic? Nope, we're still not there, unfortunately. I'll tell you what, while you are sorting that out with our fantastic tech team up the top of the room, why don't I take a couple of little questions, and we will come back to Savita. Sorry about that, Savita, but we'll definitely come back to you in a moment, okay? Okay, and maybe if the tech team, the fabulous tech team at the top, can just give me a thumbs up when we're there, we can go there. Okay, so I'm going to start with a question on activities. So It seems that engagement with research is developing spontaneously across many fields. And this is obviously coming from a need for international engagement. So I'll ask Wiebke and Marina if they can come in. What might we need programs of international engagement for? Why might we need those? Sorry, it's a difficult question, but there you go. I don't know if Marina is online.
Okay, so maybe I start.
Thank you, Wiebke.
I can maybe just kick off by saying that for somebody like me who works in a country that is geographically, far removed from sometimes where we feel the hub of all these activities and all these developments are, it's incredibly valuable and meaningful and indeed educational, in terms of capacity building, to be able to participate in international programs and sharing of expertise and exchanging of ideas, always keeping in mind, of course, that you cannot copy and paste solutions necessarily from other countries into African countries or other developing countries, but at the same time there are some skills, some approaches, some lessons learned, some tools. They are incredibly valuable tools and experience that one can use and that you can adapt and apply. When I was thinking about this talk today, I was reminded of that term that you may have heard, that they talk about make it global. So global combined with local, and use the term global, in other words, sort of global skills and expertise, but applied in a local context and cultures. We definitely would have been much further left out of the loop if it wasn't for international collaboration in this field.
Thank you. We'll move across to Wiebke now.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, as I mentioned, I think the main reason that I see is that it is actually a global crisis that we are facing, or several different crises, however, and it has to be addressed considering the interdependencies and in a global way. But the other thing is that there's so much amazing expertise out there, and we don't have to develop everything over and over again. And of course, it needs a reflection on what fits to my context and my regional or local ideas and constituencies. But I think to connect and discuss about that and adaptations to the own context is actually, shortens this process.
Thank you so much. Just double checking, do we have Savita back yet? I don't think so, because nobody's giving me a thumbs up. Okay, I'll tell you what, there was an audience member asking a question down here. Now, if you could just wait for a mic so that others can hear you as well online, and we'll go straight to your question. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm not sure if it's just a 1 second question though, because so I'm a philosopher. We don't engage the public in our debates, and there is reason to that. So let me just play the advocatus diaboli and put the argument out. I'm super keen on your response. So it seemed to me that the public engagement that you portray may not be as effective as you wish it to be. Because you invest all that time, efforts, money, and so on and so forth, despite that the deficit model has proven to be wrong. So people are not blank slates, right? They don't just have some lack of knowledge. They have certain attitudes that they have learned during their lives. And while trying to engage them, you are trying to overcome all those attitudes, to overcome all those differences that in opinions that you have with them as an expert. So why couldn't we just give up on them once they cannot be helped? Why don't we just turn to not to dissemination of knowledge or public engagement, but to making the younger generations acquire those attitudes that are required in order to understand the actual science? Because you need to have some intellectual culture to understand certain things. You need to have some intellectual attitudes to understand certain things. And just to wait until the older generations die out.
Well, thank you for that provocation. I think Wiebke's desperate to answer.
Yeah, kind of. Well, two remarks on that. The one is that I don't really see it as a goal of science engagement to overcome attitudes that people have, but rather to understand them and discuss that and reach a level where you can discuss that on eye level. And we all know that this is the only chance also to make changes if you want that, but also to accept other attitudes and to come to an agreement. And I think that is what we most need. So it's, I mean, there might be some groups that totally reject science, and where you might be right, it might not have any sense to engage with them. But this is just a very, very tiny part of society. And the other thing of what in Germany is the Bildung für nachhaltige Entwicklung, for example, so engaging with young people and focusing on them. I think we've done that for years, and the outcome is that there's a lot of engaged young people who often also grow to be older and not being that engaged anymore. And I think it's so urgent to take actions now that we should not wait for those in the position to make decisions to die out. Then we might have all died out. So I can think that that's just not an option. So, but rather to really keep in this discussion loop and really keep engaging.
Okay, I would like to reply to that as well. However, I might come back to it because I really want to see if Savita's... So if you could just hold on to that thought for a moment, that would be great. Fabulous, I'm glad to hear it. Savita, can we hear you?
I can hear you. Can
yes,
you hear me?
We can. Fabulous.
You can hear me.
We can. Woo! Yes, there's a round of applause.
I think I'll present then and not touch anything.
Please do, go ahead. Thank you, Savita.
Okay, fantastic. So I wanted to add on to what's been discussed already, and as Mhairi said, give a bit of a case study of the European BioBlitz project that we ran. We tested over the last couple of years. We're planning to run again in 2023. So there's plenty of time for challenging us, joining us, however you might want to get involved. If you go to the next slide. So the tagline that we use when we talk about this kind of area of our work is inspired by nature and informed by data. Which even that title, I think, sets up a lot of different conversations. And we talk a lot about the term citizen science and what is and isn't citizen science. And I'll leave it to you to decide if European BioBlitz fits in that category. Next slide, please. So this is a little bit about us and where this project has come from. So our charity in the UK is a collaboration of 14 organizations. The logos you can see there are a mixture of kind of regional organizations where I'm based in Bristol, Bristol Bath area, and national UK leading organizations. And our intention is for them to work together in order to do science and environmental communication. So there's kind of partnership at the heart of what we do, and then we partner with many others. So the project that we pitched as part of this Intersections project really grew out of this need that we had identified all around biological or wildlife recording. So this is, something that some of you might be familiar with, or all of you might be familiar with, but essentially finding a species from the natural world and recording where and when it was spotted. We do that a lot on paper, but more and more people are using a range of different apps to do that. One of the most popular ones, and the one that we've used for this project, is called iNaturalist. And a feeling around many people is that iNaturalist provides a kind of a platform or an area. I won't get too technical as part of this conversation, but happy to answer questions, where lots of different researchers or bodies across the world can access that data and connect it into their own species databases. So while you can go in the App Store and find many apps that will help you identify something, iNaturalist actually helps record some of that data. That's a very simplistic explanation for any tech experts in the audience. So we have really identified this need and developed this project. So if we could go to the next slide. Click on to the next one. So this is kind of an explanation of what we did for European BioBlitz. We essentially set a time scale. We said we're going to set this over 48 hours, and we want you to go out where you are across Europe and to photograph and take some wildlife records. So what happens is you take a photograph, you upload it into the app, which captures your location and the time. If you don't know what it is, there's kind of artificial intelligence, which will help make suggestions. The records are then verified by experts across Europe, not always in real time, but in further time. So each of these little dots on the map represents a record, a photograph that someone took and uploaded it into the area. So what we did, and our kind of part in this project, was essentially to encourage people to go out and take part, to use their phones, to use their apps and take part over this time period that they had set. Now, obviously, we, being based in the UK, didn't travel to all of these people, all of these places. We contacted people in many of these places, but there are many dots on the map that came without us contacting them. And when it came to evaluation, our question was, well, how many of these people, iNaturalist is growing in usage and is becoming more popular. How many people were out using it anyway? And so, an important kind of evaluation question or measure for us was, you can see at the bottom, was this comparison to how many people used the app the year before. Now, again, it's hard to point that if our marketing efforts and our networking efforts had raised the profile, or if other people raising the profile of iNaturalist had contributed to this, or iNaturalist's own marketing. But we believe really strongly that that doesn't matter. If you can go on to the next slide.
We've got a wee technical issue here again,
okay.
Unfortunately, Savita. We've got a blank slide that just says Harry S. Truman served as the 33rd president. Is that the slide you're looking for?
There is, but there should be an image on it. Otherwise, you'll wonder why on earth. Maybe click it again and see if it comes up. Come on.
No.
I'll read the quote that was on that slide.
Okay, please do.
That's come from Mhairi S. Truman, and it's sort of my favorite quote when it comes to science communication. It says, "It's amazing what you can accomplish if you don't care who gets the credit." And this really sums up for us, the power of European BioBlitz, that really the outcome that we were trying to work towards was raising the profile of iNaturalist, of wildlife recording, of getting people to spend time observing nature and recording nature. And, we had a certain project to deliver and, kind of funded deliverables, etc. But ultimately, we wanted to do is for people to take part and not necessarily about us getting the credit. The next slide, which I guess you can't see, is a kind of a set of principles that, maybe if we can share the slides after, are worth looking at. I think it's not that one, it's the one before. I'll share that diagram with you after, but when we're thinking about some of these projects, like to use a framework called New Power, if you've come across that. It was really popularized through activist literature and political campaigning literature. And it's really about the idea of creating ideas and kind of letting them loose into the world. Maybe that sounds a little bit retrograde. I love the idea of SOS, sending out stuff. But in many ways, that's what we did. We sent out the idea, we sent out the resources people needed to take part, and kind of waited to see what would happen. And that new power dynamic of kind of, some people call it maker culture in the science communication world, crowdsourcing, crowdfunding, all of these are the same types of things of really releasing and letting go of control, running our projects. So I kind of leave you with 3 questions. One that we're continuing to try to understand is, what does collaboration across geographic and language barriers mean? We ended up collaborating with a lot of people that we couldn't speak to in the same language, or that we never actually met or communicated with, but yet we were partners in this project. And I think the future of international collaboration means more of that. The second is, how much can we release control? Are we ready for that framework of it doesn't matter who gets the credit? Can your organization, take off the branding, release the methods, and the control? It's not for everyone. And the second is this kind of, the third and final is this balance of the evaluation and the outcomes. I really am inspired by the idea that when it comes to evaluation, the idea that the most interesting things are the hardest or the impossible to measure. So where do we put our effort into evaluating things we won't ever really capture, or really pushing towards the outcomes? What really matters? That's it for me.
Thank you very much. And thank you for persevering despite all the technical issues that we had there. I can tell you the diagram, the map of Europe participation. I have seen the slides. It was spectacular. There was dots right across Europe, people taking part. So yes, we're going to come to questions now. And I'll maybe come back to the gentleman here in the audience's question about parameters of identity and belief, and should we be working with people who we don't think we can change their attitudes? I've very much paraphrased what you said, but I hope you don't mind that. And I mean, I'd actually quite like to come back on that as well, because I think, yes, we do need to engage with them because they're gatekeepers. They're gatekeepers to those audiences that are easy, low-hanging fruit. So these could be teachers, they could be patient groups, they could be Black and minority ethnic community leaders, they could be church leaders in vaccination trials for tuberculosis. I say that because that's what I was doing a couple of weeks ago. And I think to not engage with them also misses out on a critical part of public engagement theory, which is mutual benefit. And the benefit to yourself as a researcher and to your institute. So things like shaping your research question. Perhaps they can't define the question, but there can certainly be public input to doing that. And placing it in new frameworks, for example. Also, let's not forget, more especially for early career researchers, their skills and development of their attributes. And there's a model out there called Science Capital. It's not just about bringing people to the research and showing them it. It's also about how people identify with the research. Do they know every time they open a door they're doing physics? Do they know every time they put a cup of coffee in the microwave it's physics and chemistry? Things like that. How do people identify? What is the heart in it? And the same applies for philosophy, I think, as it does for anything else, especially for relevance. I don't know if Marina or Savita wants to come in on that point.
Mhairi, what I could maybe add is, I think it was maybe on purpose a provocative question. We often think about, fringe groups in society who are really strongly anti-science, and as Wipke also mentioned, I mean, we know that those are really relatively small, loud but small groups in society. But for the rest, you know, for the broad communities that we want to engage with, people that are interested and affected and somehow have a stake in the research that we do, I think the question made me think about how important it is to be very, very, very clear about why we do public engagement, to think first of all about our goals and our objectives. And that I agree with what you've said and what we've also said. We don't necessarily, or actually very seldomly, go into an engagement exercise with the idea of changing people's minds or getting, avoiding or getting somehow rid of their views and their concerns. In fact, we actually go into an engagement exercise. You also stress the importance of mutual benefit, to understand their views, to understand their concerns, to understand their expectations, to find some common ground, and not necessarily to change their minds. We know from the research that respectful dialogue requires listening much more than talking to people, and valuing also their views, even if you don't agree with them. And I think if you start from there and you keep in mind that it's incredibly important not to ridicule people, not to make people feel inferior, and not to disregard people, then you sort of, that's the basics that you need for successful and effective engagement. And definitely I would never use language like, you know, should we just give up on them? Maybe it was asked on purpose in that way, but that's actually what we really would want to avoid in public engagement. That's just my view. Thanks.
Thank you, Marina. If you have any questions, please do put your hands up and we'll get a microphone to you. But I'm actually going to follow up on that one, because I'd like to ask the panelists, what can societal stakeholders bring to research being undertaken across international borders? Would anybody like to come in on that? Well, Marina, you look like you're...
I will just say one thing that's an obvious one in the context where I work, but I think it's obvious in it's relevant in many countries and in many cultures, and that is the aspect of traditional knowledge or indigenous knowledge systems, whereby people who work in environment and conservation and climate and rivers and, you know, ocean health and marine health can benefit so much from engaging with communities who have lived in certain environments for generations and have that rich tradition of knowledge, you know, from one generation to the next that they can bring to research. And of course, the other big you know, issue or big trend in the world is citizen science. You know, the difference that it can make. And I'm sure you know, other panel members will have more to say about that. You know, the difference that the public and communities can make, and the legitimacy that they can give to research projects. And you know, and the price we pay if we avoid that. We also sometimes think, what can we get and what can we lose out if we don't involve communities? There's a sort of a double-edged question there.
Thank you. Anyone else want to contribute to that?
Yeah, I totally agree with what Marina just said. The lived experience, this knowledge from non-academic expertise, like she mentioned ocean research and fishermen's knowledge, or like bringing this together can actually make the question and research more complete, I think, and in that way research does have a huge benefit from that. And the other thing is perspectives, integrating different perspectives on questions, and especially also on implications of what research findings might imply for political decisions, for regional development, whatever. So I think these perspectives, leaving them out is actually, it might even lead to failure of policy. So I think the chances are just huge to, if you include all perspectives or as many perspectives as possible, you probably never include all, but yeah.
Thank you, and that's quite interesting because we were having quite a lot of debate earlier in the conference about policy engagements and scientists engaging with policy. I think your cascading debates format is a really interesting way to ensure that that works across all stakeholders, from society, from science to political stakeholders.
Yeah, that's actually the idea, yeah, of it, to take a look at how much can we scale this up, yeah.
Superb, thank you.
Mhairi, if I could add something just very briefly, I'm really interested in scientists themselves and how they respond, to these new demands for engagement. And what I find really interesting is that scientists would, in research, and my own research and other studies, they say they go into an engagement exercise with a certain objective, but the benefits that they get from it is often unexpected. And the benefits that they list most frequently are unexpected enjoyment, the fact that they really value this chance to interact with society, but also, secondly, the new ideas they get, the new perspectives, ideas for future research, questions that they didn't think about, angles for research, how it really enriches the research. And I think those two are incredibly important because they mention over and over again and by scientists themselves who participate in this kind of activity.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. I mean, I have a million examples from anthropology through to quantum physics of research that has been shaped and benefited from conversations, including a Nobel Prize winner. Come and talk to me later and I'll tell you about that. But actually, on that purpose, I'd like to come to you, Savita, actually, about the purpose of the European BioBlitz. Because there's lots of debate about the quality of data collected, or even the usability of data collected in citizen science. But I believe you had, purpose beyond data collection. Would you like to speak to that? I'm afraid we can't hear you. Would you like to try and log out and log back in again, and we'll come back to that? Okay, thank you. Sorry, and thank you everyone for persevering with this. Again, any questions, please let us know. Or you can tweet them, actually, if you fancy. So, I'm slightly thrown because I had a list of questions. Was there a question up the back? Thank you.
Thank you. I want to pick up a bit the conversation I heard before with reaching difficult audiences. I mean, it's always being said, of course, we should try to reach them and try to engage them. But, well, do you have strategies? Or, I mean, I think it's all about the strategies in the end, how to reach them. Because, honestly, we, as science communicators, we know that the first audiences that we usually reach are the ones that are already interested in science. And if we have those events and there are almost all people that are coming are students or maybe, well, people in higher income classes, well, what are the strategies to reach those that are not engaged in science already? So I would really love to hear about maybe some also anecdotes where this happened already, and you can really tell us a bit about the practice.
Would you like to go to say that, Vika?
Yeah, which is the first thing that comes up. What is actually difficult? So I think there's like two different kind of difficult audiences. One is that, like we just talked about, like these really skeptic audience, scientific skepticism, and I think that, leaving that aside, those audiences, reaching those audiences who then do not come if, let's say, a natural history museum offers a program of science engagement. And I think then the main question is just what do they need and where are they? and really thinking in who you would like to talk to, whose perspective is still missing, whose do you want to integrate, and then take a look at where can you find these audiences, and that could be any other place. It's probably not a museum or university, and the other thing is like what do they need, what do they want, and also defining what do you want from them, and where can they benefit through this process. And I at least I have the experience that going to to these people and addressing their needs and their interests is already enough for them to get engaged, get involved. So yeah, it's that.
Yeah, thank you. I don't know if Wiebke's, if Marina is still online.
Yes, I'm here. I think it's a very important question, and a lot of discussion at the moment is about audiences. How important it is to not stick to the ones who are already, the science enthusiasts. And I think I remember at a PCST conference last year, Mike Schaefer, one of the researchers in our field, said, it's not so important to know your audience, but in the first place, pick your audience, decide who I really need to engage with around this topic, who is affected by this, who is interested in this, who has a stake. If people are somehow can see the benefit or the relevance to their lives, they're much more likely to want to engage. But it requires a tailor-made solution for each and every research topic or each and every project to define that audience, to find out where they are, to find out their communication needs and preferences, and to really tailor-make an activity that will work for them, that's designed around them, and that really gives them an opportunity to have a voice. We cannot just assume that people will be interested and willing. We have to make it clear, that there's something in it for them. But in my experience, usually, once you've across that first hurdle, people are very, very keen to engage if they can see that it's relevant to them. And the kind of audiences these days, there's the youth audiences, there's refugee groups, there's people in disadvantaged communities, there's rural groups there. We really have to think outside the box in terms of audiences, especially for engagement. And I mentioned before that engagement has limits, and this is also one of the things that I think is so important. When you disseminate information, it's relatively easy to reach hundreds, thousands, sometimes even millions of people. But with engagement, scaling up like that is not always possible. You have to select representatives of communities. You have to really think about how you're going to make sure that you engage with people who represent a certain sector of society, because meaningful engagement, by virtue of what it is, can only be done with relatively small groups of people. And that's why picking the audience and then knowing the audience and designing around the audience is so crucial.
Yes, thank you very much. I have to say we have more or less banned in the Berlin School the phrase hard to reach audiences, because that is from our perspective, and our perspective is often privileged with some of these audiences in many different ways. So I think it's just audiences who we haven't asked yet what the best way is to engage with them. And I think that's the best thing to do, is ask them. Engagement should start before your research rather than at the end, which is dissemination, of course. But actually bringing this back to an international perspective, I think it's really interesting, because a lot of the activity we've talked about here is online, necessarily because of the pandemic, but also because reach is easier through platforms such as Twitter, iNaturalist, activities like that. So my question to the panelists is really, what challenges does this create? Can it really be fully dialogic through these platforms? How do we scale it in a meaningful way?
Well, I think science engagement to me is always a smaller scale activity where you need to create a dialogue and to create a real engagement, real exchange. You cannot really scale up towards a really huge scale, I think. So all these platforms are, of course, interactive, but to me, they are not engaging. So Twitter is not an engaging platform for me. Of course, you have a huge outreach and it's interactive and people can reply, but this is not the same as really creating a dialogue and an engagement. So I really think there's a limit to scaling this up, and our idea of this cascading debates is kind of a trial run, and to have an answer to that, to really have a smaller scale, locally community-based engagement formats, but gathering the outcomes and then on a regional level discussing again with the documentation of other discussions in mind, and then really cascading this up to the decision maker level, but never really scaling the format itself. So
absolutely.
Yeah.
So it's about changing the format as you change the scale.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And Marina, if you're still there, I'm actually wondering, is there anything in the research literature that you are aware of course, that might talk about international delivery of public engagement?
To be honest, I think it's you know, this as I said before, there's been a massive interest in public engagement, lots of studies conceptualizing what it's all about and debating, you know, whether it's you know, its pros and cons and its limitations and its promises. I think taking it international is quite a new idea and what it actually means, and I think that's also why I think the activities, you know, that, for example, the Berlin School of Public Engagement that you are interested in and that we've discussed before, I think it's brave and interesting, because it will open up some new possibilities. I think we also have to be honest about, you know, what will be feasible and meaningful in terms of taking it international. But I want to come back to that term that I mentioned in the beginning is trying to make it global. In other words, making it global in terms of the lessons, the skills, the expertise, but local in terms of the context and the cultures and the local sensitivities you need. But I want to add one more thing, and that is that if we talk about planetary health and big issues, the future of our planet and a global pandemic, this kind of things, I think that for these big issues and big topics and big challenges that we face in science, international dialogue can be very, very valuable. For example, I mean, I can think of many examples, but just to say one example, if you could bring young leaders from different countries around the world together, even if it's online, to debate and to discuss, you know, the big issues in science, their concerns for the future, what they want science to deliver, so that young people from Africa and from Europe and from different parts of the world can share ideas and also learn that, you know, they have similar concerns. I think because we are dealing with big issues that affect us all, that's another reason to think why, you know, it makes sense for the dialogue also to have some international dimensions, but also, of course, supplemented by local dimensions. And so, Mhairi, to answer your question, I think in the literature as well, this is not, as far as I'm aware, a specific question that's been addressed and something a gap that we could look at for sure.
Well, that's very encouraging. So any science communication researchers in the room, there's a new field that you could be looking into, a parallel
Unless
strand.
other people, of course, know about research, I would love to know if they specifically looked at international dimensions and practice and best practices for, you know, engagement.
Fabulous. Okay, now there's one question at the back. If we could get a mic to you, please, Anetta.
Well, I just have to give this little advertisement on this platform where there's a lot of resources already available, and one of them is the UC platform. It's spelled EUSEA, European Science Engagement Association, and you'll find just about 80 different formats of science engagement there with like explanations of target groups and how to do them, but also resources, a lot of documents from international best practice, from EU projects, from experiences out of the community. So there's a lot of practical knowledge already available, but I think what we have to be self-reflective about is that engagement, as Marina has already said, and Savita and both of you as well, is not just about addressing the citizens or any kind of lay audience, but it's about narrowing it down to stakeholders, to experts who work on the similar challenges that you address in your research. And that's a different way of engaging than just inviting families or lay audience to have fun over a weekend, which can be a worth in itself, but actual long engagement processes have a shared goal of stakeholders, have experts, and it's a community that has a different practice of professionals working together, and there's a lot of knowledge there as well. So I think joining these kinds of networks is key if you want to learn more about the field. So becoming international is, I think, yeah, there's no other option than leaving the national boundaries. But then again, learning from national strategies is also interesting. In South Africa, as Marina will know, there's this national policy for science engagement. I wish we had this in Germany. I mean, this is really a policy recommendation for the national development of South Africa in science engagement. So we can learn from them as well and copy something like this. In Berlin, for the School of Public Engagement, you can do something like that.
We're on it. Thank you for that. Yes, that's a really good point. And actually, I think that also brings up the point that we ourselves are talking about valuing not just academic outputs, such as journals and papers and research, but the grey literature as well, from evaluation and case studies. And of course, Falling Walls also have a collection of case studies as well that can be looked at. Right, well, I think we need to wrap up unless there's any further questions. Oh, there is one.
Picking up again on the question of audiences and the projects that were presented here, what's the difference between science engagement in a big city like Berlin and in other places? And is how much of our science engagement debate and science communication debate is focused on being within a big university city? And what's the difference in formats, audiences, and even in the topics and the challenges of the people who are not living in such a place? And how do we reflect on this?
Very good question. Does anyone want to come into that first off? I don't know if Marina's still there. Oh, Wiebke wants to come in.
I actually don't see that much of a difference because I totally agree with Annette, and I don't like to speak so much of target audiences, but more of like interest groups that you gather and different expertises, also non-academic expertises. So there might be different topics. So probably the air quality, well, that might also be an issue in other places, but might be more of an issue where people get interested in a bigger city, and maybe there's other topics around if you're more in the countryside. But the general idea that scientists engage with expertises from non-academic backgrounds or from other academic backgrounds, and with local communities on their lived experiences, and including them into their research is not different. I think it's just there might be experts on different fields maybe, but I don't think if you have in mind where do you find your audience, where is this interest group, where is these expertises you are looking for, it might be either way, and I don't think that the formats are that different. So you always need to know the people you want to work with, where are they and what are they interested in, what are the benefits for them and for the research, and yeah.
Marina, did you want to talk to that briefly, if you don't mind? Sorry.
Very briefly. Yeah, I agree 100% with Wiebke and also Annette. The audience is determined by the project itself, and they can be, anywhere in the world, in a big city or in a rural area, and its engagement is about the two-way conversation, the dialogue, the mutual respect and mutual benefit. And science communication is, it's a very different thing. Engagement also happens, as you mentioned, at the beginning of a project and right throughout the life cycle of a project, whereas the communication and dissemination tends to happen more towards the end of the project and has a little bit more of the dissemination and the promotion and the advancement of science, whereas engagement it's got a very different objective. And I think we've discussed that now. So it's a big question, and when one could discuss that, that would be a very interesting set of questions to debate in an engagement exercise in itself. But I hope we've been able to distinguish between these different formats a little bit. There is no one size fits all, but engagement is really, really different and in terms of timing and audiences, and very much determined by the topic itself and who's interested and affected by that specific research topic.
Thank you so much. Thank you. And I would say that formats tend to be the same wherever you are. They're adapted to local circumstances. If you're in a village that you're doing a clinical trial for tuberculosis in, or if you're in a big city like Berlin, it's the purpose that changes, and the purpose you need to think about first, even before you decide what you're going to do. So that's the really key thing to shape your activity around. So I'm going to say thank you very much to our panelists. Unfortunately, Savita couldn't come back, but thank you to Marina, Savita, and to Wiebke. One more round of applause, please. Thank you to you for coming along, and thank you, I think, also maybe a round of applause for the tech team for all the issues that we got, but trying to deal with them. So please go enjoy your afternoon cake, which is a great German tradition, and we're open to conversations later today as well. Thank you. Bye-bye, everyone.